Welcome to the Big Story podcast. Today we are talking about climate action in a world that's starting to break apart. Trade wars continue, military power is being used openly to secure energy and resources, and the global cooperation needed to deal with climate change is fraying. Carbon Copy's latest Big Story looks at what this fractured world means for climate action in 2026. From Trump's return to expansionist politics, to green trade barriers, to the growing gap between where emissions are falling and where they are not. I'm joined by the authors of the story, M. Rajshekhar and Archana Chaudhary, to unpack the trends that are going to shape the climate movement in 2026, what's at stake for the global south, and whether there's still room for meaningful climate action in a divided world. So, hi, Rajshekhar and Archana. Welcome. Shekhar, let me start with you. We've had quite a dramatic start to the year with Venezuela and the ongoing tariff war, and things are moving thick and fast. In your story, you quoted the Financial Times as saying that Trump's deployment of the US military in Venezuela smacks not so much of a lurch to the future as a return to the past. So, are we seeing history repeat itself?
It's hard to say. I don't think history repeats itself, right? It keeps moving forward. Uh, Even 20 years ago, we knew that we were living through a fairly large reconfiguration of the world. Energy systems were changing, right? The world was starting to pivot away from fossil fuels to renewables, and you knew that the structure of the world would change, right? New countries would emerge as leaders in this new architecture, the ones who control the new modes of energy. Older ones would fade. And we knew that this transition, uh, as significant as the transition when man went from wood to coal, from coal to oil, was playing out yet again in our lifetimes. And we knew it would be transformative. What has happened on top of that, uh, thanks to the US, is a second huge transformation. Uh, After the Second World War, a global rule based order was created. What we are seeing right now is the jettisoning of the rule based order. Right? You had, like Carney of Canada was saying, uh, the post-war world had a particular order to it, right? There was international framework to sort of protect global human rights, and there was a global system of rules to also protect global trade. What you are seeing right now is both of these starting to essentially dissipate. So the global energy transition is something that we were all living through, right? And we knew it was going to be foundational in its impact and how it was going to reconfigure global civilization, because we are talking of things at that scale. What you've seen in more recent years after Trump took charge is uh, a jettisoning of the global rule-based order. This was always something which was opportunistic, but now you see a full jettisoning of it. Uh, you know what I'm talking about here. You had, after World War II, the world decided that, we cannot have one more global conflagration, and therefore we're going to create something which is going to be a planetary level uh, instrument of governance, which is going to keep countries in check, which is going to protect human rights, the works. Similarly, to make sure that, global trade continues, the you also had both the US and Russia creating their respective blocks of trade and creating a system of rules to make sure that this trade carries on unfettered and follows um, broad principles, right? USSR ended, and we were left with one model of economic governance for the world, Bretton Woods, and so on and so forth, where globalization was seen as the only answer. Uh, and again, broad rules outlined and ran how trade would be conducted. What you're seeing with Trump 1 for a little while with China, and now at scale with Trump 2, is the jettisoning of both these frames of global rule of law. You see what is happening with Gaza at one level. So, leaving that aside, you have the economic warfare which is underway, the weaponization of trade, the use of tariffs, and so on. This is remaking the world we live in a very, very fundamental way right now. when Archana and I were writing this report, we were just sort of thinking that, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we would not have been able to imagine a world where NATO would need to defend Europe from the US. So there is this, ours is a time of absolute chaos right now. We do not know how any of this is going to play out because the old guardrails we had on how countries comport themselves, right? Those guardrails are gone, which is what Canada's Carney spoke about in Davos yesterday. That we always knew that there was a particular level of lip service to the rule based order. Countries did act in ways that abused their power, and yet there was still a broad framework. What you're seeing today is the absolute rejection of that framework. It's like Trump saying, on being asked, what is going to modulate your behavior? And him saying, my own morality. So, this is something which is again profound in terms of uh, where we stand today. And therefore, it's very, very hard to predict even tomorrow. Leave aside, imagine what the world is going to look like 5 years later or 10 years later. Right? Uh, Second point of chaos. In all this, you are now starting to see how countries are trying to sort of isolate the US or limit their exposure to the US and carry on. In this arrangement, you now know that China will be more dominant than before. You also see that the US is trying to restrict its hegemony to the Western Hemisphere, North America and South America. Broad patterns can be discerned, right? A third variable in this is that when the global rule based order fades, you also find that the economic elite, the super rich, they start tying up with the economic elite in the countries they're interested in, and they sort of negotiate better deals for themselves. It's not a coincidence that Facebook and Google and so on are trying to export highly energy intensive, extremely water guzzling data centers to the third world. In that sense, in that limited sense, history is repeating itself because what you're now getting is old polluting industries had come down to the global south 30, 40 years ago, and that is playing out yet again. Right? A third sort of a variable where firms also start acting with a great deal of impunity because once you extend impunity to a government, I think some of that impunity also plays down the chain and attaches itself to corporations. Right. In all this, climate action is taking a real backseat. The multilateral system has weakened. The US is out anyway, uh, exiting both the sort of multilateral organizations created and underfunding the scientific institutions. You have countries switching to more bilateral arrangements. CBAM is an example. So it sort of feels to me, off the top of my head, like a time when you have four variables running unchecked. Now, the countervailing point here comes from how the rest of the world responds. And this is a leadership question. When all these countries became independent, right? You had Nehru and others step up and create NAM, non-aligned movement. So who is going to step up today? And how do you sort of take this movement and harness it and convert it again into some sort of a progressive movement for the world?
Right.
That is where we are.
Right. So then, Archana, let me ask you about this leadership vacuum now with NATO, gearing up to defend. So any funds, from the global north towards climate finance are likely to dry up. So in such a scenario, is it BRICS that should be stepping up, and coming together to keep the climate momentum going?
Uh, okay, there are multiple issues here. Like Shekhar very succinctly and very articulated what exactly is happening. The breaking down of the global alliances that have been in place for the last. Actually, it's not just the Bretton Woods system. At the moment, we are also seeing a world that is closer to, I think, the time of the American Revolution or thereabouts, where each country was to its own, and every country was doing what was right to their interest in some ways. The only layer here is the corporates, which are the all-pervading force at the moment, which is a very interesting, place where we are at such a time when you have a breakdown of the global order, the Western alliance, which was unthinkable. Like Shekhar was saying, when we were discussing this, the breaking down of a Western alliance is something that we would have never believed if we were talking about this a few years ago. But having said that, the the positives that I see, and BRICS would probably fall under that, with certain caveats, of course, is that the economies of the South, which, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it is Indonesia, whether it is Russia, South Africa, they have never been as strong in the last 45 years as they are today. They're at a place where they can actually step up and do, more if they were working with each other. Now, for BRICS is actually seen as a place of hope, or can be a platform where all these countries can do what is right for their countries, because each one of these countries is also harder hit by climate change than a lot of the other countries in the global north. Not that US hasn't been hit or Europe isn't seeing floods. There are all of that is very apparent, but yet it's manageable. It is for these countries where the impact of climate change has got to be managed urgently. The urgency is much higher, and so the resources that they have are going to have to be, and I think that is one of the reasons, and we see that very clearly, that these are the countries that are more prudent and more open about being open to ideas on how to resolve these issues. Their only issue is the resources. And it is probably time for the BRICS to look at their own partners and see how they can work together to kind of use the resources that they have to help each other. And that, I think, is principally very clear. The hitch there is the differences between these countries and whether they will be able to rise above those differences, or whether the tug of war and the power struggles that are going on even in the Western alliance, how they affect these BRIC countries, and what kind of deals are cut by the countries themselves, as well as the large corporations that are based in these countries, and how the transitions are impacted across, whether it is India, whether it is South Africa, whether it is China, how their markets then respond to the large corporations, as well as the governments who are approaching these countries for deals, and also what kind of policies the governments within themselves. So unless the internal policies of these countries are clear, and for this, it will be very important for each of the BRICS countries to have a very strong internal compass and their own policy frameworks through which they will have to. So there's battles at multiple levels that need to be fought. But first, their own houses need to be put in order, especially for countries like India, where we are already doing part of that. So we might see this happening more, where we are deciding our priorities and then we are saying, okay, within those priorities, who are the countries that are standing with us? And so far, it seems like the BRICS countries are standing with each other. We're expecting the EU, delegation to be in India. And they have been talking about cooperation and how to manage the CBAM problem. And there is also this, conversation that is happening with countries that we really did not think about earlier. Like the Middle East is a big player in this. Middle East, or we should call it West Asia, is the countries from there are a big, part of the new matrix that is being formed. But it's all at a very nascent stage, and we really need to see. This year will probably show us how the next 4 or 5 years, how the cards are going to be placed and who is going to play what. Because right now, all bets are off and a new order needs to be put in place. The universe doesn't like vacuums. So that vacuum will be filled, but what will be the cost, what will be the process, and how long it'll take is all up right now for us to still watch the patterns. I'll stop there.
Archana, in all this, the big question is also how Russia and China respond to Trump's local expansionism, right? I mean, will they oppose it, or will they try to reproduce a similar structure in their spheres of influence? What do you think is going to happen?
I think that is one of the million-dollar questions in front of us, because this whole theory that the Western US should dominate the Western Hemisphere, Russia should do what it pleases, or then it is free to do what it pleases in its sphere of influence, and China has its own sphere of influence. I really hope that the two big powers centers, Russia as well as China, are not taking cues from the US, and they don't do the same, replicate the same kind of position of power in their areas. That is the hope. It's also, I think, a time for all countries to stop and think about what is going to be achieved at the end of the day, because what we are seeing is again like this pre-colonial, or the beginning of colonial era, the fight for resources in a different way playing out again. So it really, I guess, and I think we should, I'd like to hear that also from you in terms of if Russia or China are moving ahead, then there are two critical issues here, right? It's not just showing their power in the region, it's also what happens then to the supply chains and of critical minerals, as well as what happens in the oil markets. Because ultimately, what the US has done in Venezuela, or what the US is looking at when it's seeing Greenland as a territory to occupy, it is basically looking at resources. So if this is going to be a free for all for resources, then we're going to see probably the Arctic in trouble. I'd love to hear, your views on that, and what that means then for the oil as well as critical mineral supply chains, frankly.
For me, geopolitics is a very cutthroat game, right? So the question is that will Russia and China be content with, say, one third of the world each? Or will they see this as a moment when they can really marginalize the US and end up with everybody except the US as their trading partner? In which case, they will try to sort of make sure that they to come across as globally responsible members of the rule-based order, even if the US is not there anymore. We have to wait and see how this plays out. I mean, I'm not able to imagine anything beyond that right now. But I don't think they will be content playing by Trump's rules and doing a 1/3 split of the world. Why would you do that when you can, if you have 200 countries in the world, if you're going to isolate two of them, even the world's biggest consumer economy, and carry on with the other 198, knowing that at some point Trump will step down and the rules will change. But in that period, China will have expanded. China is already putting more money into Belt and Road. So this is a very good opportunity for China to reposition itself as a global leader, as opposed to a local hegemon. I think they will be playing the long game. They've always played the long game, and this moment they will definitely play the long game.
I'd agree on that.
So
Anushka?
then my question here is, things like the CBAM now, it when it was first mooted, it was a very different world, and now, of course, we are, looking at, probably the West not being the West as we know it. So, and I know that the Global South was bracing itself for CBAM, which has come into force. Now, considering things are moving so quickly, is it really as much of a threat? And also in terms of climate progress, this was considered to be one of those. It was being, sort of packaged as a bilateral measure that in the form of climate progress. So, I'm curious to know what you guys think about whether CBAM, is going to be as critical to trade as previously imagined.
I think what we forget, and I just jumped in first, Shekhar, uh, if
Which is
you'd
just
like
as
to
well
say.
because I don't have an answer to this question.
No, but what we don't realize, uh, we're talking about BRICS, we're talking about China, Russia, India. We're talking about, I mean, India we'll come to, I'm sure, in more detail. But when it comes to all the players, what we cannot really afford to forget is EU in itself is a very powerful bloc. As long as it stays together, it is an economy that is the size that can actually compete in a big way with the US. It's a large, strong economy, and and is a very important player simply because they still have a certain agenda on setting standards, whether it comes to for the businesses or the world that we're transitioning into. And although they are vilified for being, a group of countries that does more regulation than innovation, and in some ways rightly so. But if you look at EU, and I think we should not forget that they're folks who have spent a lot of time thinking about what the new world should look like and what the standards for the transitioned economies should look like. And they are not they've been unbending so far when it comes to these standards, and I think that will continue to shape the conversations. I don't think they're stepping away from it. We know that China has already been working, along those lines, so China will probably not be affected as much, but the other BRICS countries are going to be affected in their trade with EU. And so CBAM will continue to remain a block or a barrier between running smooth relations between EU and countries like India, for instance. And we're right now seeing the FTA being played out, and hopefully we'll know by the 27th what was agreed upon and where things are headed when it comes to CBAM as well as bilateral trade. There's two things there. One is, how does the EU or the old order countries, the old world order countries, see the world, whether and themselves, and whether they are in a position where they will increasingly acknowledge where their partners stand, because that has been one of the grouses that the global South has had from the beginning of this world order being put in place, the post-World War world order, where things were being done to the convenience of the global North countries. And to some extent, that continues. CBAM is, on the face of it, yes, an extremely, friendly, environmentally friendly policy, but for the EU, it's adding a lot of costs. And so, whether they will work with their partners in a world where they need the support of countries like China, India, Russia, and whether it's Indonesia, whether it is Australia, whether they will work with them or whether they will continue to hold themselves to the, you know, colonial time standards where they are still in a place where they want to set standards. And I'm not saying here even for a moment that setting those some of those standards are right or wrong for themselves, but to be considerate of what their partners in the global South need and how they want to navigate it. From the face of it, it looks like they are at a place where they are negotiating, and Trump's policies in some ways have made it inevitable for players that were for an unusual mix of players to come together and figure out their own standing in the world, as well as how they deal with other countries in the world. So in that sense, we are living those interesting times, as the Chinese curse says, and we can only wait and watch. As far as CBAM is concerned, I think we should know sooner rather than later. So the 27th, uh, the visit of the EU delegation on 26th and 27th to India will kind of let us know where EU and India both stand on the CBAM stance. So we'll wait and watch.
Now, just to add to what Archana is saying, right?
Yes.
I'm a bit of a cynic as far as CBAM is concerned. If you look at CBAM or other green trade barriers like EUDR to stop deforestation for, say, oil palm, and you look at how they're working, okay, the first thing that you will notice is that these essentially result in a reconfiguration of trade flows. So compliant steel or compliant palm oil will happily flow to the European market, while deforestation, as in the case of oil palm, continues to meet demand from countries which are not covered by CBAM, which are not covered by EUDR.
Yeah.
I think a similar logic will play out with CBAM, where the green steel will flow to the US, to the EU at a higher markup, uh, Dirty steel will continue to flow to other markets, and steel makers will figure whether they are capable of operating in the EU or they are better off operating in non-EU markets. One
Right.
problem. The second problem is that these are, I think, actually not government led solutions as much as industry led solutions to keep themselves relevant and viable. Right. So, EUDR, for example, says that deforestation for oil palm will not be tolerated. But the core problem here is not really oil palm. The core problem here is illegal logging. It's actually logging.
Yeah.
So even as the world, debates EUDR over 10 years and comes out with it, you find that the logging industry or the timber industry in Malaysia and Indonesia is saying, ki, okay, oil palm is not viable, but timber continues to be viable, so we'll continue logging anyway. So I'm not really sure what is getting achieved. Now, it's interesting that we're talking about CBAM, but we're also seeing this great expansion of data centers.
Yeah,
So if we are talking about let's bring down emissions and so on, because the earth simply cannot afford further emissions, we will rein in the steel sector. Great. But you have now the data centers coming in, running on coal, running on pump storage projects coming up inside forests, and this is not on our radar. So then the question is that if you want to save the environment, at what scale does your intervention need to play out? It cannot be at the level of an industry. It has to be at the level of governing global sort of commons in a sense. That is the only way you can stop it because that's the only frame which is going to examine things from the standpoint of the forest itself, whether it is threatened by logging, data centers, pump storage, anything, right? The main thing is commons have to be protected. In that sense, I'm not sure CBAM is much of a solution. I think it helps the steelmakers in the EU by making them competitive again. I don't think it's not even an environmental band-aid.
I'd agree.
As it's being sold,
I
I think.
completely agree with what you said. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, so let's talk a little bit more about India now. It's in a sort of precarious position because you have the US on one side, the China on the other, and you've written that it's not wise to pick a side. Can you elaborate more? What can India do? How can it maneuver these things that are happening so quickly? What should its stance be? Neutral or pick a side?
I think first and foremost, we have to be very, very careful with the deals we sign right now. Okay, we are being coerced into signing highly asymmetric deals by the US, and those will come with very long term costs. I mean, we've had gas purchase deals and LPG purchase deals, and it doesn't make sense to pick up LPG, LNG, oil, etc., all the way from the US when there are cheaper sources available, A, in the vicinity, and B, when we are better off decarbonizing faster, the way China has done. Right? You sort of, this is what Carney says again, that you actually start off by limiting your exposure to the world at a time when risk is rising. And one way for that is really energy independence. Energy independence, however, has to coexist with ecological foundations, and therefore you cannot be embracing coal wholeheartedly. The monies that you're putting into buying gas from outside or mining more coal, I think we need to make a harder, more sustained push on renewables in this country. As it is, what the world is seeing is what I keep thinking vaguely of as decarbonization from below, where India's policy on energy has been muddled. We are simultaneously backing fossil fuels and renewables, but the price of renewables is falling extremely steeply, even that of storage. And therefore, what you're seeing in India and the rest of the world is a sort of decarbonization which is being led more by markets. Right. If you talk to your guy driving a car, he's very seriously wondering whether his next car should be internal combustion engine or an electric car. Range anxiety is coming down anyway. This pivot is continuing. It will continue because the economics are now in favor of large scale decarbonization. In that sense, the conversation is now moving away from government subsidies and incentives, which are being hijacked by lobbies in any case, to either keep fossil fuels going or to corner the benefits of schemes by a few firms. Uh, but decarbonization from below continues. Countries like Pakistan, which are using cheap panels from China, is one more example here. Our problem is that decarbonization alone is not climate action. There is a role for the state in a bunch of other things like adaptation, mitigation, all of that. And at some point, I think we have to all recognize that we have limited resources and we have to sort of make sure that those resources are being used very, very well and very, very creatively. So that is where I would sort of put this.
Right. So you're saying look inward rather than, create alliances
No,
outside.
not like that. I'm just saying that just think strategically and long term. Don't get into deals that you will regret later. Recognize that we are at a tipping point in the global energy transition. We have to capitalize on it because there come a bunch of our answers. I mean, we cannot be opening out new forests for coal mining right now. It doesn't make sense. As it is, I mean, like Carbon Copy wrote last year, our forests are extremely degraded right now. We cannot afford more forest losses. And therefore, see, like Archana was saying, this is a crisis, and therefore, this is also an opportunity. A crisis is when you reimagine what you're doing and what you can do and what you can become. Suddenly, in a crisis, the game opens out, right? So now is a chance for India to sort of reimagine itself as a country with solutions to many of the global south problems, as opposed to trying to feed the luxury demand from countries like EU and the US, right? How do we sort of move on this movement? I think is the question.
Right. Yeah, Achana.
And frankly, I think that while I agree with what Shekhar is saying, it is an opportunity. I think that India has so far handled its tensions with the US pretty well because we haven't rushed into something. We haven't so far agreed to whatever the Trump administration has tried to put pressure on us for. We do have a new ambassador, Sergey Gore, in India now. And of course, there will be probably more, an acceleration of pressure or action on the Indo-US front. But I think India has made it sufficiently clear that it can't be pushed around, in spite of being one country that has the maximum, the highest tariffs actually in the world. How we ended up there is quite a story actually, from what we'd expected in the start of 2025 to where we are ended up by the end of the year. It was a spectacular story, and but having said that, we've held our nerve so far, and I think whether it is the US or the EU, I think that credit where it's due. We've held our nerve, we've held our place, and we've not let allowed anyone to cross that line for us. I think holding on to that, while that is good, like Shekhar said, there's also a need to now see, okay, so where do you go from here? What do the next 5, 10 years look like? And I think the policy so far of ensuring that we have FTAs with a lot of other partners, whether it is the UK FTA, or whether it's New Zealand, whether it is the FTAs with UAE or with even EU now, what we are doing is we are shoring up our trade supply chains. And I can understand. I mean, that would be the first priority, and getting that done would be the most important thing. But then, where do you build? There's already a place where India. I mean, if we do get the COP 33, presidency, if we bid for it and we get it, which is what seems to suggest we are bidding for, then in that case, it's also a great opportunity the next 2, 3 years to be able to build our position as climate leaders, as global south leaders, and work closely. And we have done that. The gap between China and India, for instance, has narrowed when it comes to trade, when it comes to business. And I think that's a wiser way to go forward.
Right. But in a time when we didn't really have an NDC this year. We were supposed to put that forth. There's also the National Adaptation Plan which hasn't come through. So in such a scenario, what is climate really a priority for India and even the world at large? I mean, there's so much happening. Fossil fuels have taken up, or all of the attention. So, what does that mean for the climate movement in its entirety? For this year, is it going to be a priority, or has it's going to be slipping further down?
So on climate action, as Trump denies climate change, and funds for climate NGOs start to come down, partly because the US is withdrawing, and partly because a bunch of other funders are starting to see the fight against climate change as a lost fight. So I think climate action stands at an interesting place too now. Uh, it started with a bunch of civil society organizations and scientists trying to bring climate change onto the global agenda. You had a bunch of people putting money into civil society organizations trying to whip up awareness, put pressure on policymakers, and so on. Uh, that is the moment that process got us till where we are today. Now, as Trump sort of denies climate change, cuts back on climate funding, a bunch of funders in the US and outside are starting to think that this is perhaps a lost cause, and therefore they're looking for other areas to invest in. Bill Gates is an example. He said that, maybe we should focus more on poverty than climate change, right? At the same time, however, climate change effects have become far more visible in the world. And so, this is where the climate action fraternity has to also retool itself. How do you sort of establish your finances on a more secure basis than just money coming in from a handful of philanthropic donors who are going to be whimsical? How do you build stronger bridges and relationships with people on the ground? I think that is this moment as well. I'm curious to see how it evolves.
I have a slightly more optimistic view of what it means for the climate movement because I think the pressure that has come is sudden. And anytime pressure comes that is sudden, because I don't think anybody expected the Trump presidency to take so many turns at the same time. Last year has been extraordinary when it comes to even Trump's, going by Trump's record, because in the first presidency, the kind of pressure that we saw coming from the US were of a different kind. And while the line remains the same, the actions are a lot more sudden, and there is a sudden feeling of change which needs to be adapted to immediately. And a certain insecurity also obviously that rises when priorities are changed. And obviously, whether it's individuals or institutions, everybody is kind of rejigging and finding. It's like suddenly lights be turned off in a room. You have to then figure out in a crowded room where to stand securely, and I mean that it feels a bit like that to me, even though it's a lame analogy. But like Shekhar said, the impact of climate change is being felt more than ever before. I don't think even Trump can deny the kind of fires that the US saw last year and the kind of changes that they continue to see within their own country. For India, it's definitely a non negotiable. There is no way that Russia is not seeing changes. And while it may sound very good that there will be Arctic supply chains that shipping lines that might be opened up, even then the overall impact when you don't have water to drink, when you don't have clean air to breathe. We saw people on the streets in Delhi. That was an organic reaction. So thinking with this kind of pressure that will build up from the ground is not going to go away, and not responding to that is not something that any government or any institution or especially corporates will be able to afford. So we will, I think, see corporates look at climate as a bigger risk as well as responding to it. We will see governments being forced to pay attention to it. I think it's a temporary shift away of focus, but unless there is a big war or there is some sort of a disturbance that completely shakes the world, which is not an impossibility. I mean, it's very much within the realms of possibility at the moment, the way things are headed. But unless something of that import happens, I think there will be a stream of focus on how to manage the impacts that are coming up and how to build then uh, an economy keeping those risks in mind. So I don't think that we can afford to go too far from those thoughts, and I don't think we will.
Right. So then, I think the main takeaway from all of this is that the climate crisis isn't unfolding in isolation. It was already grappling with the question of inequality, and now you add geopolitics and trade to the mix, and it's just it'll be interesting to see how all of that will play out this year. On that note, thanks Rachik and Achna for joining us. You can read the full story on carboncopy.info. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, guys.